March 14th, 1883. We're in London. It's a Wednesday, and it's, that typical gray, miserable London weather. We're standing in Highgate Cemetery, which is this sprawling kind of Gothic place that always has this heavy feel to it. But on this specific afternoon, the whole scene is just, well, it's almost underwhelming.
Right.
There is a fresh grave dug in a pretty remote corner, and standing around it, shivering in this damp air, is a group of people. And I mean, when I say a group, I'm being pretty generous.
There are 11 people.
11 people. It's a startlingly low number, isn't it?
It really is. You've got some family, a few really close friends, and that's it. There are no crowds. There's no fanfare at all.
Exactly. So if you were just, I don't know, a passerby walking your dog through Highgate that day, you wouldn't have even stopped. You'd have seen the small coffin and probably thought, well, there goes another poor soul who didn't quite make a mark on the world.
Just another funeral.
So, just another funeral. The man in that box was 64 years old. He died sitting in his armchair. He was stateless. I mean, literally, a man with no country to claim him. He was plagued by terrible health, covered in these awful boils. His lungs were shot, and he'd spent the last 30 years of his life just living on the ragged edge of poverty in the slums of Soho.
It's the very definition of an ignoble end. A quiet disappearance. And yet, this is the supreme irony of modern history.
It is.
Because if we were to just fast forward, say, a few decades, which is really just a blink of an eye in historical terms, from that quiet afternoon at Highgate, the name of that failure would be shaking the absolute foundations of the earth.
It's almost impossible to process the scale of that turnaround. I mean, within 70 years of that funeral, the ideas of the man in that grave would be governing the lives of over 1/3 of the entire human race.
1/3. It's staggering.
His face, the one, that bearded, stern face, it would be printed on banners the size of skyscrapers in Moscow and Beijing, Havana, Pyongyang. He would become the best hated and at the same time the most loved figure of the millennium.
And we are, of course, talking about Karl Marx.
Yeah.
And I think the mission for this deep dive is, well, it's really specific. We've got this massive stack of sources here, biographies, his personal letters, which are just incredibly revealing.
So revealing.
Historical analyses, his really dense economic texts. And our goal is to tunnel underneath all that 20th century mythology. We want to strip away the Soviet statues, the Cold War propaganda, the gulags, and, the fanatical worship, and just find the actual human being who lived and breathed and struggled in the 19th century.
And that's the real challenge, right? Because Marx isn't just a person anymore. He's an adjective. He's a Marxist. He's a symbol.
A symbol, yeah.
But the sources, they paint a picture of someone so much more complex. We aren't just looking at the father of communism. We're looking at a romantic husband who was absolutely crazy about his wife, a grieving father who had to watch his own children die of poverty, a rowdy student who carried a sword.
The sword.
And a philosopher who didn't just want to sit in a room and think. He wanted to grab the world by the throat and shake it until it changed.
It's a story that's just full of contradictions. I mean, how does a man who couldn't even manage his own household budget write the definitive critique of global capitalism?
Right.
How does a man who basically lived in a library inspire armed revolutions in rice paddies and factories he'd never even seen?
So let's start at the beginning. If we want to understand the revolutionary, we have to look at the soil he grew up in. And I think the first big shock for most people, especially if they picture Marx as this, champion of the working class, is his actual background. He wasn't exactly working the coal mines, was he?
No, far from it. This is not a rags to riches story at all.
Yeah.
Karl Marx was born on May 5th, 1818, in a town called Trier.
Right, in the Rhineland.
Exactly, which at the time was part of Prussia. And the Marx home, well, it was comfortable. We're talking about a 10-room townhouse.
Wow.
The family owned vineyards, they had servants. This was a solid upper-middle-class existence.
But there's a twist right there at the start, isn't there? Specifically about religion. I think a lot of people know Marx as the religion is the opium of the masses guy. But his family lineage was deeply religious.
Oh, it was. For centuries, on both sides of his family, his ancestors were rabbis.
Mm-hmm.
His paternal grandfather was the rabbi of Trier. His maternal grandfather was a Dutch rabbi. The whole Marx family line was just steeped in Jewish scholarship and tradition. But, and this is the crucial context of Prussia in the early 19th century, Karl was not raised Jewish.
And this wasn't because his father, Heinrich Marx, had some sudden spiritual awakening that Lutheranism was the one true path.
Right, no, not at all. This is pure survival. Heinrich Marx was a lawyer, and he was a man of the Enlightenment. He was liberal, educated, successful. But after Napoleon was defeated, the Rhineland was taken over by the Prussian kingdom. And the Prussians immediately rolled back all the civil rights that Jews had enjoyed under French rule. They passed laws saying that Jews could not hold public office or practice law in the state service.
So Heinrich is just backed into a corner. He's a lawyer with a family to feed. If he stays Jewish, he loses his entire career.
Precisely. So shortly before Karl was born, Heinrich made a very pragmatic decision to convert to the Evangelical Church of Prussia, so Lutheranism. It was a career move, plain and simple.
Wow.
And young Karl was then baptized when he was 6 years old. So this means Marx grew up in a home that was technically Christian, but culturally it was something else entirely. It was a home of the Enlightenment.
A child of the Enlightenment.
Yeah.
That phrase keeps coming up in the biographies. What does that actually look like for a kid growing up in Trier in the 1820s?
It means that his father wasn't reading him the Bible or the Torah at bedtime. He was reading him Voltaire, Kant, Newton, Locke.
The big thinkers.
The big thinkers. Heinrich was a man who believed in reason with a capital R. He believed that the world was rational and that through education and liberty, humanity would just keep improving. And young Karl was homeschooled by this man until he was 12. He just soaked up this optimism, this belief that you could use your brain to solve the world's problems.
So you got this incredibly bright, maybe a little bit pampered boy. He's brilliant. He knows he's brilliant, and he's sent off to high school where he just breezes through everything. But then come the university years.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where we see a version of Marx that I absolutely love because it just shatters that image of the stern, bearded philosopher. We have to talk about Party Karl.
Party Karl is a very, very apt name for the 17-year-old who showed up at the University of Bonn in 1835. His father sent him there to study law, to follow in his footsteps.
Mm-hmm.
But Karl, well, let's just say Karl had other priorities.
The sources here are genuinely hilarious. He joined something called the Trier Tavern Club. And he's not just a member. At one point, he's a co-president. And this isn't some debate society. It's a drinking club.
It was a rowdy association of students from his hometown.
Yeah.
And Marx just threw himself into it completely. He was drinking heavily. He was piling up debts that absolutely terrified his father. And it wasn't just, harmless fun. The records show he was actually carrying weapons.
A pistol or a sword.
Both at different times. But specifically, he carried a sword for dueling.
Dueling?
Yeah, this was a part of German university culture at the time, but Marx actually got involved. He fought a duel, and he got a wound cut just above his left eye. Can you imagine that? The man who wrote Capital engaging in sword fights in his freshman year?
It's such a visceral image. And he was even thrown in jail for a bit, wasn't he?
Yes, for disturbing the peace and for drunkenness. The university archives have these notes about his wild rampaging.
Mm-hmm.
He was loud, he was boisterous, he was spending money he didn't have. He was basically a typical frat boy, but with this massive intellect that he just wasn't using for his studies.
And his poor father, Heinrich, is back in Trier getting these bills and these reports. He must have just been pulling his hair out.
Oh, he was frantic. There are these letters from Heinrich that are they're heartbreaking and they're stern at the same time.
Yeah.
He writes to Karl, basically saying, "You are breaking my heart. You are wasting your talents in these taverns." And Heinrich realizes that Bonn is just too fun. It's too lax. If Karl stays there, he's never going to become a lawyer. He'll just be a drunk with a scar over his eye.
So the dad pulls the plug.
He intervenes decisively. After just 1 year, he transfers Karl to the University of Berlin. And this is a major pivot point. If Bonn was the party school, Berlin was the serious school. It was the intellectual center of gravity in all of Germany.
And this transfer, it just changes everything. Because in Berlin, Marx encounters a ghost. He meets the spirit of a man who had died a few years earlier, but was still haunting every single classroom and coffee shop in the city.
Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. You cannot tell the story of Marx without grappling with Hegel. It is absolutely impossible. When Marx arrived in Berlin in 1836, Hegel had been dead for 5 years, but Hegelianism was the state philosophy of Prussia. It was the air everyone breathed.
Okay, we need to pause here and do a little bit of the heavy lifting. Hegel is notoriously difficult. I mean, philosophy students literally weep over his books. But to understand what Marx did, we need to understand what he started with. How do we explain the core of Hegel to someone who isn't a philosophy major?
Okay, so the central engine of Hegel's thought is the dialectic.
The dialectic. Let's try and unpack that.
So Hegel looked at history, and he didn't see just a random list of events. King X died, then a war happened, then a plague. He saw a pattern. He believed that history moves forward through conflict, through contradiction.
The famous thesis, antithesis, synthesis model.
Right. Although Hegel himself rarely used those exact words, it's the best way to visualize it. So imagine a state of affairs. Let's call that the thesis. It exists, but it's not perfect. It's incomplete. Okay. And because it's imperfect, it generates its own opposite, its own resistance. That's the antithesis. These two forces clash. They struggle. And out of that struggle, they don't just destroy each other. They merge and they rise to a higher level, the synthesis. And then that synthesis becomes the new thesis, and the whole process starts all over again.
So conflict is actually good. Struggle is the motor of progress. Without that clash, history just stands still.
Exactly. But here's the catch, and this is what Marx would eventually attack. Hegel was an idealist.
An idealist, what do you mean by that?
He believed this whole process, this dialectic, was happening in the realm of ideas, of the spirit, or Geist, as he called it. He thought history was the story of the human mind evolving toward the idea of freedom. So for Hegel, the material world, what we touch and eat and build, was just a reflection of these great ideas battling it out.
So for Hegel, if you want to change the world, you have to change the ideas. You change the philosophy.
Yes. And initially, Marx falls for this hard. He joins a group called the Young Hegelians, or the Doctor Club. And these are the bad boys of the philosophy department.
Right.
They met in beer halls in Berlin, but not to drink and sing like in Bonn. They were there to argue about atheism and politics.
So these guys were radicals.
Oh, they were. They took Hegel's dialectic, this idea that everything changes through conflict, and they basically weaponized it against the Prussian government and the church. They argued that the Prussian state wasn't the end of history, as Hegel might have suggested, but just another stage that needed to be overthrown by a new idea.
And Marx fits right in. He stops going to his law classes entirely. He grows that famous beard. He starts writing this fierce romantic poetry. He becomes a philosopher. But then he does something that kind of splits him from the rest of the group. He flips Hegel completely on his head.
This is the big aha moment. Marx reads another philosopher, a guy named Ludwig Feuerbach, who argues that Hegel has it all backwards. Feuerbach says, we don't start with God or spirit, we start with flesh and blood.
We start with real life.
Exactly. And Marx takes this idea and just runs with it. He develops what we now call historical materialism.
Which is a fancy term, but let's ground it. What is he actually saying?
He's saying, Hegel is wrong. Ideas don't drive history. Real life drives history. It's not the spirit struggling toward freedom. It's a starving peasant struggling to get bread from a feudal lord. It's the way we produce the things we need to survive that determines what we think.
So the economic reality, what he calls the base, creates the culture, the religion, the laws, the superstructure.
Exactly. You don't change the world by changing ideas. You change the world by changing who owns the factories, who owns the land, who owns the tools. The dialectic isn't idea versus idea. It's class versus class, master versus slave, lord versus serf. And now he says bourgeoisie versus proletariat.
It's such a grounding shift, isn't it? He takes philosophy out of the clouds and just drags it down into the mud and the factory floor. But while his brain is doing all these incredible gymnastics, we have to talk about what his heart is doing. Because there's a love story here that is honestly quite shocking, especially given the social rules of the time. Jenny
von Westphalen. And this is not just a footnote. This is the central relationship of his entire life. And you're absolutely right. On paper, this marriage should never have happened.
So paint the picture for us. Who was she?
Jenny was known as the most beautiful girl in Trier. She was the queen of the ball. But more importantly, she was a baroness.
Baroness.
Yes. Her father was a high-ranking Prussian aristocrat. She was also 4 years older than Marx.
So you have the daughter of the aristocracy and the son of a middle-class Jewish convert lawyer. In 1830s Prussia, that's a massive social canyon to cross.
Oh, God, it's scandalous.
Yeah.
But they fell in love when they were teenagers, and they actually got engaged in secret. They had to keep it hidden for years because they knew their families, especially hers, would completely disapprove.
What I find so fascinating is that Jenny wasn't just, a trophy wife or a passive muse. The sources describe her as brilliantly intelligent.
She absolutely was. She was his intellectual equal. Throughout his entire life, she was his first reader. She was the one who transcribed his atrocious handwriting. And if you've seen Marx's handwriting, that is an act of true love.
I can imagine.
She debated with him. She believed in his genius even when he was dragging her and their family through abject poverty and exile. She gave up a life of velvet cushions and society balls to live in slums with a revolutionary.
And that brings us to the start of his career, if you can even call it that. Marx gets his PhD in 1841. He sends his thesis to the University of Jena because he knows Berlin is way too conservative to pass him. He's now Dr. Marx. He's ready to be a professor. But the door just slams shut in his face.
Yeah, the Prussian government had really turned against the young Hegelians. Being an atheist and a radical Democrat was a career killer. He's blacklisted. No university would hire him.
So he pivots. If he can't teach, he'll write. He becomes a journalist.
He becomes the editor of the Rheinische Zeitung in Cologne in 1842. And this is crucial because it's the first time Marx has to deal with real-world problems, not just these, philosophical abstractions. He starts writing about the peasants in the Moselle region who were being prosecuted for theft because they were collecting fallen wood in the forest.
Fallen wood, you mean sticks on the ground?
Yes, exactly. For centuries, it was a common right for people to gather dead wood for their fires. But the new private owners of the forests wanted to monetize everything, so they criminalized this ancient custom.
Wow.
And Marx was just furious. He wrote these scathing articles attacking the government for prioritizing the property rights of tree owners over the literal survival of the poor.
So he's seeing the law as a tool of the rich.
Precisely. And he's so good at attacking them, his pen is just so sharp, that the Prussian censor and even the Tsar of Russia, who apparently read the paper, complained. In 1843, the paper is banned. Marx is unemployed again.
And this just sets the pattern for his whole life, doesn't it? Write something, offend the government, get banned, get exiled. He realizes he can't breathe in Germany anymore, so he marries Jenny in a simple ceremony, and they move to the capital of revolution, Paris.
Right, late 1843. Paris. I mean, if you were a radical in the 19th century, Paris was Mecca.
It was the place to be.
The city was just alive. You had socialists, communists, anarchists, poets, artists, all of them crammed into these cafes, plotting the overthrow of the old world.
And it's here, in this pressure cooker, that Marx meets the other half of his brain.
Friedrich Engels.
Okay.
The meeting happened in August of 1844 at the Café de la Régence. They had met briefly before, but they didn't really get along. This time, though, they spent 10 days together, just talking nonstop. And they realized they were intellectual soulmates.
Just talk about an odd couple. We've established Marx, the messy, bohemian, intellectual, completely broke scholar.
Yeah.
Engels is, well, he's fancy.
Engels is a total paradox.
Right.
He was the son of a wealthy German textile manufacturer. He worked in the family business. He spent his days managing accounts and overseeing factory production in Manchester, England. He rode horses with the English gentry. He drank fine champagne. He was a bit of a ladies' man.
He was capitalist.
By day, yes.
Oh.
But by night, he was a revolutionary. He hated his job. He hated the factory system. He called it huckstering. And just before meeting Marx, he had written The Condition of the Working Class in England, which is still one of the most harrowing accounts of industrial poverty ever written. He had been inside the slums that Marx had only ever read about.
So Engels brings the data. He brings the practical, on-the-ground knowledge of how money is made and how workers are crushed. And Marx brings the philosophical framework to explain why it's all happening.
And let's be blunt about it. Engels brings the wallet.
Right.
For the rest of Marx's life, Engels is the one paying the rent, buying the food, sending the money orders. Marx simply could not have survived, let alone written capital, without Engels' constant financial subsidy. It was a partnership in every single sense of the word.
And while he's in Paris, Marx writes this set of notes that weren't even published until the 1930s, long after he died. They're called the 1844 manuscripts. This is where we get the concept of alienation. And I really want to deep dive on this because I think this is the part of Marx that speaks most to people today, even if they hate his politics.
I completely agree. The theory of alienation is Marx at his most humanist. He's asking a really fundamental question. What does capitalism do to the human soul?
And he breaks it down into 4 types. Let's walk through them.
Okay, so the first is alienation from the product. Think about a medieval craftsman, like a shoemaker. He takes the leather, he cuts it, he stitches it, he shapes the shoe. At the end of the day, he holds it up and he says, I made this. This is an expression of my skill.
He sees himself reflected in the object.
Right. Now contrast that with the industrial worker. He stands at a conveyor belt. He pulls a lever. Or he tightens one single bolt on a car that just moves past him. He doesn't make the car. He doesn't own the car. The product of his labor is taken away from him instantly, sold by someone else for a profit he will never see. The very object he creates stands against him as an alien power.
It's like it's ghosting him. He pours his life into it and it just disappears.
The second is alienation from the process of work itself. This is about what the work feels like. Marx says that under capitalism, work is forced labor. You don't work because you have a creative urge to make something. You work because if you don't, you starve.
It's a means to an end.
It is. The work is repetitive, it's mind-numbing, it's exhausting. You are not yourself when you are working. You only feel like yourself when you leave work.
That's the whole weekend warrior mentality, isn't it? I hate my job, I just live for Saturday. Marx saw that 170 years ago. He said work should be our highest expression, but instead, it's this torment we have to endure just to survive.
Exactly. The third is alienation from our species being. This one's a bit more philosophical.
Right.
Marx believed that what makes humans special, what separates us from, say, bees or beavers, is that we consciously shape the world around us. We plan, we create for beauty, we change our environment. Capitalism, he says, reduces us to the level of animals. We just work to eat, to sleep, and to procreate. Our humanness, our creativity is stripped away.
And the fourth type?
Alienation from other workers. Instead of seeing your fellow human as a partner or a community member, you see them as a competitor.
That guy wants my job.
That guy wants my job. Or she's willing to work for lower wages, so she's my enemy. The system isolates us. We are alone in a crowd, all fighting each other for crumbs.
It's a profoundly lonely vision of society. And just he's writing this in his 20s. But he doesn't stay in Paris for long. The Prussian government, who are, again, just obsessed with him, they pressure France to kick him out. So in 1845, he gets the boot. The family moves to Brussels.
And Brussels is where the theory really turns into political action. Marx and Engels join a secret society called the League of the Just.
Which sounds like a superhero team.
It does, doesn't it? They eventually convince the group to change their name to the Communist League. And in late 1847, the League asks Marx and Engels to write a manifesto, a simple, punchy statement of what they believe and what they want.
And this leads to what might be the most relatable Marx moment ever. He procrastinates.
He totally does. He sat on it for weeks. The Central Committee in London actually had to send him a letter in January 1848 saying, "Citizen Marx, if the manifesto is not here by February 1st, we're going to take action against you."
Nothing like a hard deadline and a threat to get the creative juices flowing. So with Engels' notes as a guide, Marx sits down and just hammers out the Communist Manifesto in this frantic burst of writing.
It was published in February 1848. It's short, only about 12,000 words or so, but it is absolute dynamite. It opens with that famous Gothic line, "A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism."
It reads like a thriller, but let's look at the core argument. It's not just rich people suck. It's a whole theory of history.
Yes. The opening line of the first section says it all. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles.
Right.
So Marx argues that history isn't complex or random. It's a binary fight. Freeman versus slave. Patrician versus plebeian. Lord versus serf. And now, in the modern era, it's bourgeoisie, the owners, versus proletariat, the workers.
And he creates this incredible narrative. He actually praises the bourgeoisie at first, doesn't he?
He does. He writes that the bourgeoisie has accomplished wonders that far surpass the Egyptian pyramids. They built railroads, they've tamed nature, they've created a global market. But, he says, they are like a sorcerer who has summoned a demon they can no longer control.
And that demon is the proletariat.
Right. By building these massive factories and forcing millions of workers together into cities, they have inadvertently created the army that will destroy them. He calls the working class the gravediggers of capitalism. He predicts that the workers will eventually realize their collective power, unite, and overthrow the entire system.
Workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains.
It was a call to war.
Yeah.
And the timing was just spooky, because just weeks after the manifesto hits the streets, I mean, literally while the ink is still wet, Europe catches fire.
The revolutions of 1848.
It was called the Springtime of the Peoples. From Paris to Berlin to Vienna to Italy, people just poured into the streets, barricades went up, kings fled their capitals. It really seemed like Marx's prophecy was coming true instantly.
And Marx rushes back to Germany, to Cologne. He takes over a newspaper again, the Neue Rheinische Zeitung. He's in the thick of it. He's calling for a war against Russia, which he saw as the big policeman of Europe. He's demanding democracy. He thinks this is it. The revolution is finally here.
But it wasn't. The revolutionaries were divided. The middle class got scared of the workers and ended up siding with the kings. The armies remained loyal to the monarchs. And by 1849, the counter-revolution just sweeps across Europe. The uprisings are brutally crushed.
And Marx is on the run again. He's put on trial in Cologne for inciting rebellion. He actually gives a speech to the jury that is so impressive that they acquit him. But the government just expels him from the country anyway.
Yeah.
He goes to France. France says, no way, he has nowhere left to go.
There was only one country in Europe that remained open to political refugees, Great Britain. So, in August of 1849, Marx sails across the English Channel. He expects to stay for maybe a few months until the revolution starts up again. Instead, he would stay there for the rest of his life.
And this begins the London chapter of his life. And if you have any kind of romantic image of the struggling artist, you need to just delete it. This was grim.
It was a descent into the abyss. The Marx family, Karl, Jenny, their children, and their loyal housekeeper, Helene Demuth, who was known as Lenchen, moved into 2 small rooms on Dean Street in Soho.
And Soho in the 1850s was not the trendy, fashionable place it is today. It was a slum.
Oh, it was filthy. There was no indoor plumbing. Cholera outbreaks were common. The air was thick with coal smoke. And the Marxes were absolutely destitute. They had no income. They were entirely dependent on handouts from Engels and the occasional bit of journalism work.
There are these reports from Prussian spies, because, yes, the police were still watching him.
Of course.
That described the apartment. They said everything was broken, covered in dust, books piled up everywhere, kids just playing in the chaos.
The poverty was visceral. Marx writes these letters to Engels that are just painful to read. He says things like, I cannot leave the house because my clothes are in the pawn shop, or my wife is crying. The baker refuses to give us any more bread on credit.
And the human cost of that poverty was just terrible. They had 7 children in total. Only 3 survived to adulthood. 4 of them died in infancy or childhood.
The death of his son Edgar, whom they all called Mush, in 1855, is really the emotional nadir of Marx's life. Mush was 8 years old, and he died in Marx's arms, most likely from complications related to the terrible living conditions.
God.
And Marx was just absolutely shattered. He wrote to Engels, I have suffered every kind of misfortune, but I have only now known what real unhappiness is.
It humanizes him in such a tragic way. He's trying to save the world, but he can't even save his own son from the effects of poverty. He's writing about the cruelty of capitalism, while that very cruelty is killing his family.
And yet, in the midst of all this grief and squalor, there is a scandal that really complicates our view of Marx as a moral figure. We have to talk about the Lenchen affair.
Helene Demuth. Lenchen. She was the housekeeper. She had been with Jenny since childhood. And she worked for the Marx family, basically for free, just for room and board, doing all the cooking and cleaning.
And in 1851, while they are all living in this tiny, cramped apartment, Lenchen becomes pregnant.
And Marx is the father.
Yes. But you have to think about the situation. Marx is the leader of the Communist Party. He is married to Jenny, whom he loves deeply. If it comes out that he has fathered an illegitimate child with his unpaid servant under his own roof, he is ruined. The whole movement is ruined.
So they engage in a cover-up, and this is where Engels earns his Best Friend of the Century award, or maybe Enabler of the Century, depending on how you look at it.
Engels steps up. He claims paternity. He tells everyone, it's my child. The baby boy, Friedrich Demuth, is born and is immediately fostered out to a working-class family. Marx never acknowledged him. And Engels kept that secret for 40 years. It was only on his deathbed, long after Marx and Jenny were both dead, that Engels finally told Marx's daughter Eleanor the truth.
It's just so messy, it's hypocritical. Here's the man railing against the exploitation of the working class, while he arguably exploits the loyalty and the body of a working class woman in his own home.
It is a profound contradiction.
Yeah.
And it just shows that, great thinkers can be deeply flawed human beings. But life went on. And while all this domestic chaos was swirling around him, Marx escaped every single day to his sanctuary.
The British Museum.
Specifically, the reading room. He would walk there every morning, he'd pass a security guard, find his usual seat 07 apparently, and he would sit there from 9 a.m. until 7 p.m.
And what is he doing all day? He's not really writing philosophy anymore, is he? He's doing math.
He is studying the anatomy of the beast. He's reading the blue books, these official government reports from British factory inspectors. He's reading about child labor, about accidents where people are literally crushed by machines, about 16-hour workdays. He is just drowning himself in data.
And he's suffering physically while he's doing it. We mentioned the boils earlier.
The carbuncles. And these aren't just pimples. These are massive, infected, agonizing abscesses. He had them on his back, his legs, his posterior. Sometimes he couldn't even sit down. He had to stand at his desk, raging against the system in constant physical pain. He famously told Engels, I hope the bourgeoisie will remember my carbuncles until their dying day.
He literally blamed capitalism for his skin condition.
Well, he blamed the stress and the poverty, which he saw as being caused by the system. And out of all this pain and all this research, in 1867, he finally publishes Volume 1 of Das Kapital. Capital.
The magnum opus, the book that, no one really reads, but everyone talks about. Let's try to crack it open. We talked about alienation, which is the psychological side of his critique. Capital is the economic side. It's where he tries to prove mathematically that capitalism is fundamentally based on exploitation.
Right. And the foundation of it all is the labor theory of value. Simply put, the value of any commodity is determined by the amount of socially necessary labor time that's required to make it. So if a table takes 4 hours to make and a chair takes 2 hours, the table is worth 2 chairs.
Okay, that seems straightforward enough.
Now, enter the capitalist. He has money. That's his capital. He wants to make more money. So he buys raw materials, wood, glue, whatever. And he buys a very special commodity, labor power. He hires a worker.
Okay, so let's say he pays the worker 10 shillings for a day's work.
Right. And here's the trick. The worker starts working. Let's say that in 4 hours, the worker adds 10 shillings worth of value to the wood. He has now earned his wage. He is paid for himself.
So by lunchtime, they're even.
Exactly. But the capitalist didn't hire him for 4 hours. He hired him for the whole day.
Yeah.
So the worker stays. He works another 8 hours.
And who gets the value that's created in those next 8 hours?
The capitalist. That is surplus value. The worker is effectively working for free for the entire afternoon. That surplus value is the source of all profit.
So Marx is basically saying that profit isn't a reward for taking a risk or for being innovative. Profit is literally the unpaid wages of the worker.
Yes. And here's the real deep dive nuance. Marx says the capitalist has to do this. He's not necessarily some evil guy twirling a mustache. If he pays the worker the full value of his labor, he makes no profit. If he makes no profit, he goes out of business. The system itself forces him to squeeze the worker.
And Marx creates a little formula for this, doesn't he, MCM?
Money. Commodity, more money. The goal of the entire system is not to make shoes or tables. The goal is to turn money into more money. The actual product is just a necessary evil in the middle of that process.
And Marx predicts this whole system will eventually just blow up.
He calls them the internal contradictions. He argues that capitalists will always compete with each other. To win, they'll invest in better machines to produce things faster. But machines don't create value. He says only labor creates value. So as they rely more and more on machines and less on workers, the overall rate of profit in the economy falls. And to compensate for that, they have to squeeze the remaining workers even harder, lower wages, longer hours.
Leading to what he calls immiseration. The rich get richer and fewer because of monopolies, and the poor get poorer and more numerous.
Until the rubber band just snaps. The workers realize the system is rigged against them and they take over the factories. He thought this was scientific. He thought he had discovered the laws of economics, just like Newton had discovered the laws of gravity.
Well, while he's writing all this heavy theory, he's not done with politics. In 1864, he helps found the International Working Men's Association, which becomes known as the First International.
This was a really big deal. It was an attempt to unite all the labor groups of Europe, English trade unionists, French socialists, German communists, all under one big umbrella.
But it immediately turns into a cage match. In the red corner, Karl Marx. And in the, also red corner, Mikhail Bakunin.
Bakunin, the father of modern anarchism. This rivalry is legendary. They absolutely hated each other.
So what was the beef? I mean, they both wanted to overthrow capitalism, right?
Yes, but they disagreed fundamentally on the how, Marx said. The workers must seize the state. We need a dictatorship of the proletariat. We'll use the power of the government to crush the bourgeoisie and then transition to communism.
And what did Bakunin say to that?
Bakunin said, if you take over the state, you just become the new oppressor. He famously warned, and this is a quote we should really pay attention to, that if you took the most ardent revolutionary and gave him absolute power, within a year he would be worse than the Tsar himself.
Wow. That is hauntingly accurate when you look at the 20th century. Stalin, Mao, Bakunin called.
He really did. Bakunin argued that Marx was an authoritarian at heart, and Marx argued that Bakunin was a disorganized dreamer who would never get anything done. Marx eventually won the political battle. He managed to get the anarchists expelled from the International in 1872, but the whole organization kind of fell apart soon after that.
But before it fell apart, they had one brief moment of hope. 1871, the Paris Commune.
Right, the Franco-Prussian War caused the French government to collapse. And the workers of Paris seized control of the city. For 2 months, they ran it themselves. They established this radical democracy. No police force. The people were armed. Factories were run by the workers.
And Marx is watching all this from London, and he is just electrified.
Oh, yeah. He writes, the Civil War in France, defending the Commune, he says, this is it. This is the dictatorship of the proletariat in action. And for him, it wasn't a police state. It was a radical democracy.
But then the French army comes back and just crushes the commune. Thousands are executed. It's a total bloodbath.
It was.
Yeah.
But the pamphlet that Marx wrote made him famous. For the first time, the newspapers of Europe knew who he was. They started calling him the Red Terrorist Doctor. They thought he was the mastermind behind all the chaos, even though he wasn't really. He finally had the fame he wanted, but he was running out of time.
We're entering the final act now, the late 1870s and early 80s. Marx is famous, but he's broken.
His health was completely deteriorating. The carbuncles, the liver problems, the bronchitis. He was traveling to spas, to Algiers, trying to get better. He basically stopped writing. Volume 2 and 3 of Capital were just these piles of messy notes that he couldn't bring himself to finish.
And then the tragedies just strike home. December 1881, Jenny dies.
And that was the end of his world. Engels visited him and said, "The Moor is dead too." The Moor was Marx's nickname among his friends. He survived her by 15 months, but he was basically a ghost.
And then January 1883, his eldest daughter, also named Jenny, his firstborn, his favorite, dies of cancer.
That was the final blow. He returned to London, just unable to recover, and on March 14th, 1883, Lenchen, the housekeeper, went upstairs to check on him. She came back down and told Engels, "Come up. He is half asleep." They went up, and he was just sitting there in his armchair near the fire. He wasn't asleep. He was gone.
And so we return to that funeral. Engels gives the eulogy. He says, "Mankind is shorter by a head and by the most important head of our time."
Engels then dedicated the rest of his life to securing Marx's legacy. He took those messy piles of notes and he edited them into volumes 2 and 3 of Capital. In many ways, Engels is the one who invented Marxism as a coherent system. Marx had the flashes of genius. Engels built the monument.
So let's land the plane. We have to talk about the legacy. Because the great irony is, Marx expected the revolution to happen in England or Germany, the advanced capitalist nations.
Right. His whole theory said, capitalism must fully develop before socialism can replace it. But history played a cruel joke on him. The revolutions actually happened in Russia and China agrarian peasant societies that were barely capitalist at all.
So people like Lenin and Mao had to kind of twist Marx's theories to make them fit their situations.
Exactly. They turned the dictatorship of the proletariat into the dictatorship of the party. And that led directly to the totalitarianism that Marx, despite his own authoritarian streak, probably would have been horrified by. He wanted freedom from toil. He didn't want the gulag.
But Bakunin would say, "I told you so. The seeds were there all along."
And that is a very fair critique. Marx's focus on centralizing power and his intolerance for dissent did lay some of the groundwork for what came later, even if he didn't intend for it to happen.
But if we put the Soviet Union aside for a moment, does his analysis of capitalism itself still hold up?
Surprisingly well. Every time there's a global financial crisis, sales of capital just skyrocket.
Really?
Yeah. Why? Because he predicted that capitalism is inherently unstable. He predicted globalization. He predicted that capital would concentrate into fewer and fewer hands. He predicted that economic power would inevitably translate into political influence.
When you look at the world today, the massive inequality, the global markets, that feeling of alienation in the workplace, it's hard to say he was wrong about the diagnosis, even if you completely disagree with his cure.
He gave us the vocabulary to understand our world. Words like exploitation, surplus value, class struggle, these are all tools that he forged.
There's a famous story from his later years. Marx was reading about some French Marxists who were spouting all these simplistic slogans, and he just sighed and said, "All I know is that I am not a Marxist."
It's the perfect final thought, isn't it?
Yeah.
He knew that once his ideas left his head, they would be twisted and turned into something else. He was a man, not a dogma. A man who loved and fought and drank and thought harder than almost anyone else in the 19th century.
And whether you see him as a prophet or a demon, you cannot deny that the man in that lonely grave at Highgate changed the trajectory of the human species.
He certainly did.
If you enjoyed peeling back the layers of history with us, make sure to subscribe to History Titans. Hit that like button and share this deep dive with a friend who loves a good biography. It really helps us keep the history alive. Let us know in the comments. Was Marx a prophet of the modern economy or a misguided utopian? We read every single comment. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next deep dive.